In the darkest hour of the 20th century, when the world was torn apart by the greatest war, a group of men were called to do something greater than anyone could imagine. Some were college students, some were workers, sons, and ordinary middle-class citizens from small towns across America who volunteered to join a newly formed military unit. This was Easy Company, or E Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army. They were trained to become part of the American military. The shout of Currahee at Camp Toccoa, Georgia, would forge them into warriors bound as brothers. And on the night before D-Day, June 6, 1944, they received orders that would change the course of war history forever. That was to jump into the darkness over the skies of Normandy to pave the way for the greatest invasion in history by the Allied forces to defeat the Nazis. At the height of World War II, their strategy was not just the front line, but to strike behind enemy lines to support the Allied amphibious landing mission on the historic day of D-Day. These soldiers would be remembered as Easy Company of the 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army. And what made Easy Company different wasn't just their bodies or weapons, but the bonds between the soldiers of Easy Company. It was trust in the man beside you, knowing he would never leave you behind no matter the situation, because paratroopers were the spearhead of the invasion. If they failed, the entire invasion could collapse. This is their story. Easy Company is a story of friendship, sacrifice, and courage that transcends fear for something greater, something that could change the fate of the world, from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of Ardennes. They endured the freezing cold at Bastogne to Hitler's headquarters at Berchtesgaden and the discovery of Nazi darkness. They would witness humanity's darkest hours and help bring light back to a Europe that had been shrouded in shadow for years. This is the story and heroism of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. People who jumped into the darkness of Europe not knowing if they would see the light of a new day again. We all call them E Company or Easy Company. But among the paratroopers, they called each other Band of Brothers. And you, the audience, are with the history of war with the Watcher. Chapter 1. The Forging. In the summer of 1942, while Europeans had been at war for over 3 years, a group of young American men gathered together. Some were merely farmers, miners, students from Harvard, Yale, UCLA. Some had struggled since childhood, without even clothes to wear, without even a radio to use. But they had one thing in common: a strong heart and faith in their nation. They volunteered to become paratroopers because they wanted a challenge, wanted honor, and wanted extra pay. But the deeper reason was that they wanted to prove themselves and wanted to be with people ready to fight. These young servicemen who enlisted grew up during the Great Depression. Many struggled, but never lost faith in life or their country. Everyone came here knowing they would have to sacrifice their youth to a war they didn't start, but it was inevitable. They decided to turn this experience into an opportunity for growth, knowing almost nothing about paratroopers. They only knew it was a new unit, required hard training, and everyone had to volunteer. But that's what they wanted, because they wanted to be stronger than their former selves and train alongside the people they would fight shoulder to shoulder with. And this led to Easy Company. Easy Company was born at the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. This unit had to train both parachuting and infantry at the same time, the first time in U.S. Army history. They needed 500 volunteer soldiers to select down to just 148. According to statistics in the book, of over 5,300 soldiers, only 1,800 completed this course. They came to live together and train hard at Camp Toccoa, Georgia. The first test they encountered was Currahee, a 1,000-foot mountain that became both a training ground and symbol of easy company. The word Currahee means, "We stand alone, but we stand together." They had to run up and down as routine. Some vomited, some collapsed, some quit on the first day. Everyone in this unit was new to this mission, so they had to learn together. Lieutenant Herbert Sobel became the first commanding officer of E Company, or Easy Company, with Executive Officer Clarence Hester. Many were officers fresh from officer candidate school, including Lieutenant Richard Winters, or Dick Winters, Lieutenant Lewis Nixon, and Lieutenant Matheson from UCLA. At that time, since Lieutenant Sobel was 28 years old, he was considered the oldest in the group, because others were no more than 24 years old. The first enlisted soldiers of Easy Company included Frank Perconte, Herman Hansen, Winzig, Clifford Carwood Lipton. Additionally, there were many more paratroopers, including Lynn Compton, Ronald Spears, David Webster, Donald Malarkey, George Lewes, Joseph Liebgott, and William Guarnere. Within a few days, this unit had 132 men and 8 officers, divided into 3 platoons: headquarters section, machine gun squad, mortar squad, and a complete support team. Only a few from the original Easy Company group passed the training at Toccoa. Lieutenant Winters recounted that you could tell at a glance who wouldn't survive, because some were like butter, falling just from walking. The paratroopers of Easy Company had to train brutally: push-ups, pull-ups, night marches, weapons training, communications training, code usage, explosives, and field operations. No one got easy rest, and the slightest mistake, like an unpolished rifle or dirty ears, could result in immediate revocation of weekend passes. And the person watching wasn't just anyone, but Lieutenant Herbert Sobel. He wasn't tactically brilliant, but strict on discipline. Even though everyone hated him, Sobel was the one who made Easy Company the strongest through training more brutal than anyone else's. This is an undeniable truth. For example, ordering Easy Company soldiers to run up and down Mount Currahee several times a week became legendary. Once they were tricked into eating spaghetti, then Lieutenant Sobel immediately ordered everyone to run up the mountain. Many Easy Company soldiers vomited and fainted. Those who asked to ride the ambulance were cut from the program. So Currahee translated to, "We stand alone, but we stand together." It became the motto of the 506th Unit. Winters acknowledged that Sobel played an important role in creating the unit's strength, even though Sobel lacked judgment and true leadership. But even so, the hatred toward him became what forged Easy Company into a unified whole, as the motto says, Currahee. Easy Company soldiers said that Sobel made us excellent soldiers, but we all hated him. This was the unanimous statement of Easy Company soldiers. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Richard Dick Winters became the opposite of Sobel. He was a leader whom followers loved and didn't want to disappoint. The conflict between the two became the driving force that made Easy Company even more tight-knit, because they bonded through sweat, tears, and the sound of footsteps during brutal training they would never forget. They crawled under barbed wire with real machine gun fire, and the ground was scattered with fresh pig hearts, livers, and intestines. Until Lipton said we crawl like snakes, not like babies. As the Army once said, we may not be able to force you, but we will definitely make you comply. So what happened in Easy Company, or what happened to the soldiers, proved this statement. The exhaustion, brutality, and counting cadence made them bond and become one family. Not long after Easy Company was founded, all 140 soldiers became one. The training experience they went through made them understand the word unity. Private Don Malarkey also said it was the most important experience of my life. I have to thank Hitler for letting me meet the finest group of men in my life. The brutal training in Easy Company created many excellent foundations, including Evans, Guarnere, Lipton, Martin, and Dick Winters, and many others I haven't mentioned. When they completed the course in November, Easy Company soldiers felt like they had been through hell together and nothing could destroy them anymore. Until Colonel Robert Sink read an article that said a Japanese military unit had marched 100 miles within 72 hours. This made Colonel Sink want to prove his soldiers could do better, so he ordered the 2nd Battalion, including Easy Company, to march from Toccoa to Atlanta, a distance of 118 miles with full gear. They had to march through terrible weather conditions, facing rain, snow, and cold winter winds. Easy Company managed to complete the march within 75 hours, and only 12 people couldn't reach the destination. Lieutenant Moore's unit was the only one where everyone completed every step, and they were honored to lead the parade in Atlanta. However, despite being exhausted to the point of breathlessness, when the soldiers met the welcoming band, those sounds energized many of them instantly. Malarkey said the pain disappeared like magic. After finishing training, Easy Company wasn't just a military unit. They had become one family. They knew each other. Even shadows at night could tell them who it was. This was the bond forged from the training ground, and it would become even stronger in the days ahead. Chapter 2. The Path to Becoming Paratroopers. In December 1942, Easy Company moved to a new location, Fort Benning, Georgia. It was the place every warrior was waiting for because it was the beginning of becoming true paratroopers. Even though Camp Benning was located in a scorching hot area with the nickname Frying Pan because it was full of sand and dry weather, for soldiers from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, it was a signal of progress and a stairway to the Silver Wings. The parachute course at Fort Benning was divided into 4 stages, A, B, C, and D. But for Easy Company soldiers who had already gone through brutal training at Toccoa, their bodies were stronger than standard, so instructors had to skip stage A to B. This meant every morning, Easy Company soldiers had to run to the parachute shed to practice parachute folding, organize systematically, then return for lunch before entering afternoon training, which was jumping practice from airplane models, including gliding down from a 30-foot tower and practicing parachute control from cable lines. After passing Stage B, the next was Stage C, the heart of training, because they had to jump from a 250-foot tower and practice controlling the parachute in the air while braving strong wind currents from giant fans, as well as learning how to land safely, not just surviving, but landing at precisely designated and stable targets. And when reaching Stage D, the final test of the parachute base, every man had to jump from a C-47 aircraft 5 times, and each time they had to inspect their own parachute until midnight and wake up at 5 in the morning, then walk to Lawson Field. According to the book, their first time was filled with fear and at the same time full of dignity that wouldn't accept defeat. The engine roared loudly as the aircraft climbed to 1,500 feet. Suddenly, the red light flashed, accompanied by the command for all soldiers to stand up, to hook their parachute lines to the static line, get in formation, and wait for the command, go. Finally, statistics showed that 94% of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment passed training and received silver wings on their chests. This set a new record for the Army's parachute school and elevated their courage to a new U.S. Army standard. On December 26, 1942, every man received certification as a paratrooper. And at the parade ceremony, Colonel Robert Sink proudly declared, "You are members of one of the best regiments in the United States Army and in the world." Then he granted everyone 10 days' leave with the stern warning, "Remember our dream, Currahee. We stand alone, but we stand together." However, freedom must come with responsibility. 9 soldiers who returned late from leave had to be severely punished by having their silver wings torn off in front of the company and sent back to be regular infantry. It was an important lesson that Easy Company might receive special training, but there was no special exemption from discipline either. Before they moved to Camp McCall, training conditions became increasingly intense. There was practice jumping with heavy weapons weighing 100 pounds, practice attacking in the forest for several days like special forces. At the same time, Lieutenant Sobel, the same training officer, remained very strict, becoming the target of hatred among Easy Company. He would take soldiers' belongings and steal rifles while soldiers slept. But then Lieutenant Sobel went and stole from other companies, causing trouble. Additionally, they had to practice medical procedures, simulating situations by having Sobel be the wounded person, and the medical team had to really cut open his stomach, claiming this was training, but in reality it was revenge against Sobel. Although no one admitted who masterminded it, this was a sign that stress was accumulating severely, and they dared to retaliate against Sobel. However, even though Easy Company had problems with their commander, they still achieved the highest physical fitness scores in Army history and did even better in the second round of testing. In early May 1943, Lieutenant Harry Welsh joined Easy Company. This man had been demoted 3 times due to personal aggression, but even so, he had natural leadership and the same leadership philosophy as Executive Officer Dick Winters. An officer must lead from the front. This made the two become close friends. In late May, Easy Company moved to a new place, Camp Shanks in Kentucky. They trained hard in field conditions and ate SOS food. They had to dig latrines in the middle of the forest, jump from aircraft that were scorching hot, making many soldiers vomit into their helmets. They had to walk through forests at night, and their feet were covered in mud for days. But even so, no one complained. Everyone endured and fought on. When mid-July arrived that year, they finished training with Major General William Lee, praising that Easy Company was the most outstanding unit and would achieve even greater feats in battle. In the final period before going to battle, they traveled to Fort Bragg. In mid-August, Easy Company boarded 20 train cars heading to the transport ship that would take them to the European battlefield. Captain Sobel wrote letters to every soldier's mother, encouraging them. "Soon, your son will jump from the sky into battle and defeat the enemy. He will have the best weapons and equipment, along with months of hard and brutal training to prepare for victory on the battlefield. The letters you send regularly, full of love and encouragement, will forge their warrior hearts. With this, he will never fail, but will seize victory and bring honor to himself and make you proud, making the nation eternally grateful in its time of need." Commander of Easy Company, Captain Herbert Sobel. Before the ship slowly sailed away from the dock and the Statue of Liberty gradually disappeared on the horizon amid silence and pounding hearts, everyone knew their lives would never be the same again. Chapter 3. The Voyage of the Samaria. The troop transport ship Samaria, converted from an old India passenger ship, departed from New York to Europe for war. On this ship, over 5,000 young men were loaded, even though in reality, the ship was designed to accommodate only 1,000 people. Among them were soldiers from Easy Company, cramped in narrow, lightless rooms. On September 15th, they landed at Liverpool, England, before traveling to a small village in Wiltshire. This was a small, quiet village that became Easy Company's new home, where they would live for over 9 months. This wasn't an American military camp, but a real village, and the villagers viewed them as outsiders. But gradually, the relationships between the soldiers and locals became warmer. The soldiers had to adapt to the English climate, cold and damp, quite different from sunny America. During this time, they continued intensive training, night jumps, weapons practice, field maneuvers, and preparing for the real mission. The officers and soldiers of Easy Company knew that someday they would have to use everything they had learned on a real battlefield. But before that day came, they had to endure waiting, training, and building bonds that would become unbreakable in the days ahead. The village became a second home, where they could rest, write letters to families, and dream of returning home. But everyone knew that before they could go home, they had to face a great trial, a trial that would change their lives forever. Captain Sobel continued to be strict on discipline, making decisions that the soldiers didn't agree with. The conflict between him and his men escalated until it reached a critical point. Several NCOs, led by Sergeant Mike Ranney, wrote a letter refusing to serve under Sobel's command in combat. This was a serious act that could result in court-martial, but they were willing to risk it because they believed Sobel's leadership would lead to unnecessary deaths on the battlefield. The result was that Sobel was transferred to another position, and Lieutenant Thomas Meehan became the new commander of Easy Company. But this was only temporary because Meehan would die on D-Day, and Lieutenant Dick Winters would eventually become the true leader of Easy Company. During this time in England, the soldiers of Easy Company continued to train and prepare. They practiced everything: attacking fortified positions, jumping from aircraft in full darkness, coordinating with other units, and using new equipment. They knew the invasion of Europe was coming. They just didn't know when or where, but they were ready to prove they were truly the best unit. Ready to jump into the darkness and fight for freedom. Ready to become band of brothers in the truest sense. Chapter 4. D-Day and Normandy. June 5 to 6, 1944. The night before, D-Day, the greatest amphibious invasion in history. Easy Company soldiers, along with thousands of other paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, prepared to jump into the darkness over Normandy, France. Their mission was to secure key positions behind enemy lines before the beach landings at dawn. Lieutenant Dick Winters, now a platoon leader, prepared his men. Their faces were painted with dark camouflage. Each man carried over 100 pounds of equipment: weapons, ammunition, explosives, rations, and personal items. They boarded the C-47 aircraft, sitting in 2 rows facing each other in the cramped fuselage. The engines roared to life, and the planes took off into the stormy night sky. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the darkness as they approached the French coast. The red light turned green. "Go! Go! Go!" the jumpmaster shouted. One by one, the paratroopers jumped into the chaos, but the jump was disastrous. High winds, anti-aircraft fire, and pilot-evasive maneuvers scattered the paratroopers across miles of French countryside. Lieutenant Meehan's plane was shot down, killing everyone aboard. Dick Winters became acting commander of Easy Company. Winters landed alone in a field, cut away from his equipment bundle, and began searching for other soldiers. He heard the distinctive metal cricket clickers that paratroopers use to identify each other in the dark. Click, clack, click, clack. Slowly, he gathered a small group of soldiers, not all from Easy Company, but from various units. The invasion was in chaos, but the chaos worked in their favor. The Germans couldn't determine where the main attack was coming from. Easy Company's primary objective was to destroy a battery of German 88mm guns at Brecourt Manor that could fire directly onto Utah Beach. With only 13 men, Winters led the assault against a fortified position defended by 50 Germans. Using textbook infantry tactics, they assaulted the position systematically, destroying each gun in turn. The action was later taught at West Point as a perfect example of small unit tactics. Winters would receive the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership. But the cost was heavy. Several men were wounded, and Private John Hall was killed. It was Easy Company's first combat death, and it shook the men deeply. Over the following days and weeks, Easy Company fought through the hedgerows of Normandy. The bocage country, with its ancient hedgerows forming natural fortifications, made every field a potential death trap. The fighting was brutal. Close-quarters combat where you could hear the enemy breathing on the other side of the hedge. Private Albert Blythe, a replacement soldier, froze in combat, temporarily blinded by fear. Winters talked to him, telling him that the only way to overcome fear was to accept that he was already dead, and anything beyond that was a gift. Blythe found his courage and rejoined the fight, only to be seriously wounded shortly after. He survived, but would never return to Easy Company. The company took the town of Carentan after fierce fighting. They held defensive positions against a German counterattack, with tanks rolling directly at their positions. The men held their ground, firing bazookas and machine guns until the attack was repulsed. By the time Easy Company was pulled off the line in Normandy, they had been in continuous combat for over a month. Many of the original Toccoa men were wounded or dead. Replacements arrived who hadn't gone through the same brutal training, creating friction within the unit. But they had proven themselves in combat. They were no longer just trained soldiers, but combat veterans. They knew what it meant to kill or be killed. They knew the cost of victory. Captain Richard Winters, promoted from lieutenant, reflected that war brought out the best and worst in people. He saw acts of incredible bravery and deep cowardice, sometimes from the same person. War, he realized, was not glorious, but necessary. Easy Company rested and absorbed replacements, preparing for their next mission. They didn't know it yet, but an even greater challenge awaited them. Operation Market Garden. Chapter 5. Operation Market Garden, September 17, 1944. Operation Market Garden was the largest airborne operation in history, designed to end the war by Christmas. The plan was audacious. Drop 3 airborne divisions to capture bridges across the Netherlands, creating a corridor for armored divisions to drive into Germany's industrial heartland. It was Field Marshal Montgomery's bold gamble. The 101st Airborne would drop around Eindhoven to secure bridges leading north. Easy Company, now part of a veteran division, jumped in daylight this time. The jump was far less chaotic than Normandy. Most men landed in their designated drop zones. The initial objectives were achieved quickly. The Dutch people welcomed them as liberators, offering food, wine, and flowers. For a brief moment, the soldiers felt like heroes rather than just soldiers doing a dirty job. But the operation quickly began to unravel. The British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem, the farthest bridge, met unexpectedly strong German resistance. The corridor became known as Hell's Highway as German forces counterattacked from both sides. Easy Company fought along the highway, defending key positions and counterattacking when the Germans tried to cut the corridor. The fighting was intense but different from Normandy. Here they could maneuver in open terrain rather than being confined to hedgerows. One night, Easy Company was tasked with rescuing British soldiers trapped in a village. They moved through darkness, led by Lieutenant Harry Welsh. The rescue was successful, but it demonstrated the desperation of the situation. The operation lasted 64 days instead of the planned few days. Market Garden failed to achieve its objectives. The British at Arnhem were forced to withdraw after taking massive casualties. The war would not end by Christmas. For Easy Company, Market Garden was both a success and a failure. They accomplished every mission assigned to them, but the overall operation failed. They lost good men for objectives that ultimately didn't shorten the war. Private David Webster, who had been wounded in Normandy and was now returning to the company, was struck by how much the men had changed. They were harder, quieter, more cynical. The enthusiasm of D-Day was gone, replaced by grim professionalism. During Market Garden, tensions within Easy Company also surfaced. Some of the original Toccoa men resented the replacements, viewing them as inferior soldiers who hadn't earned their place. The replacements felt like outsiders, never fully accepted. Winters, now company commander, worked to bridge these divides. He reminded the veterans that they were once replacements too, and that every man deserved respect until proven otherwise. The fighting also brought out the complexity of war. Easy Company soldiers saw German soldiers who were little different from themselves, young men far from home, fighting for their country. The propaganda image of the evil Nazi began to blur with the reality of individual German soldiers who were just as scared and tired. Private Joe Liebgott, a Jewish soldier known for his aggression toward German prisoners, began to show signs of the psychological toll. He had joined the army to fight Nazis, but the constant violence was changing him in ways he didn't like. When Easy Company was finally pulled off the line in mid-November, they had been in combat for over 2 months straight. They were exhausted, depleted, and hoping for a rest. Instead, they were sent to France for what was supposed to be a quiet sector. It was a decision that would lead to their greatest trial, the Battle of the Bulge. Chapter 6, Bastogne, the Siege, December 16, 1944. The Germans launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, catching the Allies completely off guard. It was Hitler's last gamble to split the Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. The 101st Airborne, including Easy Company, was rushed to the Belgian town of Bastogne, a critical road junction. They arrived by truck, moving faster than the German advance. Their mission was simple: hold Bastogne at all costs. The men of Easy Company dug foxholes in the frozen ground of the Bois Jacques, a forest outside Bastogne. The temperature dropped below 0. Snow began to fall. The soldiers had no winter clothing, no cold weather gear, insufficient ammunition, and little food. For weeks, they held the line in the worst conditions imaginable. The cold was as deadly as the enemy. Soldiers got frostbite, trench foot, and hypothermia. Some froze to death in their foxholes. Medical supplies ran so low that morphine was reserved only for the most severe wounds. The Germans surrounded Bastogne completely. The 101st was cut off, outnumbered and under constant artillery bombardment. When the German commander sent a surrender ultimatum, General McAuliffe sent back a one-word reply: nuts. Easy Company lived in those frozen foxholes for weeks. Every day brought artillery bombardment. Tree bursts from German shells exploding in the trees above showered them with lethal wood splinters. The constant shelling created a psychological torture as men waited to see if the next shell would land directly in their foxhole. Private Eugene Doc Rowe, the company medic, worked tirelessly to save wounded men with minimal supplies. He moved from foxhole to foxhole during bombardments, often using his body to shield wounded men from shrapnel. He watched men die from wounds that could have been treated if he had proper medical supplies. The siege reached its lowest point on Christmas Day. There was no celebration, only cold, hunger, and fear. Some men wondered if they would ever see another Christmas. Then, on December 26th, the weather finally cleared. American planes appeared overhead, dropping desperately needed supplies. More importantly, fighter bombers began attacking German positions. The air support lifted everyone's spirits. On December 30th, Easy Company was ordered to assault the town of Foy. The attack was led by Lieutenant Norman Dyke, who had recently been assigned to the company. The assault quickly fell apart as Dyke appeared to freeze under fire, unable to give coherent orders. Captain Winters, watching from a distance, saw the attack stalling. In a split-second decision, he ordered Lieutenant Ronald Spares to take command of the company and renew the attack. What happened next became legendary. Lieutenant Spares, already known as one of the toughest officers in the regiment, ran through the town of Foy, still occupied by Germans, to reach 1st Platoon on the far side. After coordinating with them, he ran back through Foy through enemy fire to return to the main position. No one could believe it. The Germans were so shocked by seeing a single American officer running through their positions that many forgot to fire. Carwood Lipton later said, "He just ran through the middle of the town. The Germans were so surprised they forgot to shoot." Spears took command of Easy Company and successfully captured Foy. He would remain in command until the end of the war, earning the nickname the General Killer. A name that even Dick Winters reserved only for him. The siege of Bastogne finally ended in mid-January, when Patton's Third Army broke through from the south. Easy Company had held for over a month in the worst conditions of the war. The cost was devastating, 82 casualties, with 15 killed. But the name Ronald Spires became a symbol of leadership in crisis. He was a leader who didn't command from the rear, but led from the front, challenging death himself. From the beaches of Normandy to the frozen forests of Bastogne, Easy Company had proven that ordinary men could do extraordinary things when bound by brotherhood and led by courage. Chapter 7. Operation Nordwind, January 28 to February 23, 1945. After surviving the brutal test of Bastogne, by mid-January 1945, while the German army was defeated at the Battle of the Bulge, they opened a new game in Alsace. Under the code name Nordwind, North Wind, Easy Company, having just come through heavy combat, had to prepare for a new mission. They were sent to the small town of Haguenau near the German border. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne had to travel from Bastogne to Haguenau, a distance of over 257 kilometers. They had to travel through freezing weather, which caused Sergeant Lipton to become ill with chills until he had to be sent for treatment. They found that Sergeant Lipton had pneumonia, but even so, Sergeant Lipton insisted he would return to be with his friends in easy company because he refused to abandon his duty. Incredibly, he eventually recovered completely. On February 5th, Easy Company took up positions in Haguenau, a large city on the Motor River. There they received orders to rest comfortably, but in truth, everyone knew that nowhere in war was truly safe, because Easy Company still held the front line, only 30 meters from the German army with just the river between them, and machine gun fire still echoed constantly. Webster, a soldier from Easy Company, said there was no safe territory here. Even silence could kill you. On a night in March 1945 in Haguenau, France, an Easy Company patrol was preparing to cross the river using rubber boats blending into the darkness. The goal of this secret mission was to capture German prisoners for intelligence. But when the mission began, they found crossing the river wasn't easy because some boats capsized, causing some soldiers to be swept away by the water. Some were ordered to abort the mission and return to base. Importantly, they had to be silent. Webster, Liebgott, and fellow soldiers from Easy Company slowly paddled quietly. The patrol divided into two groups, one group led by Lieutenant Harry Jones, another by Sergeant Jackson. Both moved toward their destination silently. Sergeant Jackson led 8 soldiers in an assault on a house by the river, suspected of being a German operations base. They threw hand grenades into the basement before rushing in quickly. But then Private Eugene Jackson, who had recently arrived as a replacement, was hit full in the face by grenade shrapnel. He screamed for his friends to end his life in desperation. Finally, Jackson died in the arms of Mercier, and Webster recorded with painful tone that he wasn't even 20 years old. The mission successfully captured 3 German soldiers, but one was critically wounded and couldn't be brought back. Webster and his friends tried to end that suffering with a hand grenade, but the agonized sounds didn't stop until someone threw the last grenade to finally end his life. The mission was considered successful because American soldiers crossed back with 2 prisoners. Webster recorded about the captured prisoners that both German soldiers stood still like stones, not moving or showing any signs of fear. Although this mission ended successfully with captured prisoners, they had to exchange it for losses both in strategic terms and the spirit of Easy Company, because they lost Eugene Jackson, and Lieutenant Jones was also wounded in this mission. After this mission, Lieutenant Harry Jones was transferred to serve at the division headquarters. Webster wrote during that time, "I once dreamed of being a writer, but in war, dreams don't help you survive. Only instinct will bring us home." After completing this mission, Easy Company began to understand that war didn't kill you just with guns, but it could change you into a different person. A person who didn't know fear, didn't know feelings, and importantly, wasn't even sure if humanity remained. The soldiers from Easy Company who survived stood firm through time, through patrols of death, through snow, through ice-cold water, through silence more brutal than explosives, even though there were no enemies to shoot that night. In the silence of the Motor River, they were saddened once more to lose someone, Lieutenant Jones and Private Eugene Jackson. Chapter 8. Discovering the Darkness. As the time neared the end of World War II in Europe, Easy Company marched into Bavaria, Germany, the location of the Nazis' last fortress. Then, on April 29, 1945, they stopped overnight in a small town in southern Bavaria, not far from the Alps mountain range, near the town of Landsberg. That overnight stop led them to encounter a Nazi concentration camp for the first time. This was one of over 100 subcamps of the Nazi Dachau network, although the camp they found was merely a labor camp, not a direct killing camp. But the living conditions were beyond imagination. Easy Company soldiers encountered horrific scenes. They saw prisoners in striped pajamas in a state of starvation and emaciation. And heartbreakingly, Easy Company soldiers and soldiers of the 101st Airborne had to encounter depressing scenes because they saw hundreds of corpses lying in rows on the ground. At first, they didn't know who these people in striped pajamas were. At first, they thought they were merely criminals, before everyone learned the truth that those wearing these outfits were not criminals. Some were doctors, teachers, businessmen, fathers, and grandfathers. The reason they had to be here and wear striped pajamas was because they were Jewish. Major Winters found a large pile of cheese in the basement of the building he used for battalion headquarters. He ordered soldiers to distribute that cheese to the Jewish people. He radioed headquarters to explain the situation and request help before General Maxwell Taylor arrived at this camp, and he was so angry he declared martial law and ordered the citizens of Landsberg, aged between 14 and 80, to travel to the camp the next morning and bring cleaning equipment, whether rakes, shovels, and brooms, and sweep up the filthy remains from the actions of the Nazi government. And when that time came, the group of Landsberg civilians traveled to the camp and encountered the truth before their eyes. They had to help clean the camp, because General Maxwell wanted the townspeople to know and see the truth about what happened from the Nazi government. When evening fell that day, the civilian group walked back from the camp. It was recorded that some townspeople still vomited and some were traumatized by what they had seen with their own eyes. This event was also an important milestone, reflecting that these young American soldiers didn't just come to fight for victory in war, but they came to end evil beyond description. And Winters wrote that they bowed their heads when we looked at them through the barbed wire fence. It was a scene like dogs that had been beaten and tortured for so long, always fearful and anxious. It was an indescribable feeling, and one I would never forget. The feeling of seeing those people behind the fence made me say to myself, "Now I know why I'm here." Chapter 9. The Eagle's Nest. After Adolf Hitler's death, this was the moment of the Nazis' end and World War II in Europe. Because when entering May 1945, the war in Europe entered its final chapter. But for the soldiers of Easy Company, their mission was not yet finished. On the contrary, they were entering an unofficial race with soldiers from other Allied nations. It was a bet for historical honor, and the destination of this race was Berchtesgaden, a resort town in southern Germany hidden deep in the mountains, known as the Eagle's Nest. It was Adolf Hitler's luxurious mountain retreat and the resting place of high-ranking Nazi leaders. Of course, Allied forces, whether from America, Britain, France, or the Soviet Union, all tried to be the first unit to reach this destination. And finally, Easy Company claimed victory this time. On May 8, 1945, when Germany declared surrender, Easy Company stood on the ground of victory, and they had arrived at Berchtesgaden. Many soldiers decided to take items from there back home to America as souvenirs that they had once visited this eagle's nest. When the war in Europe ended, Easy Company had spent 337 days there, from the Normandy landings until today at Berchtesgaden. Easy Company became one of the most outstanding combat units in U.S. Army history. They celebrated quietly with just one hope: to go home. But the mission wasn't finished yet. After VE Day, they were sent to Austria to a town called Zell am See for occupation duty. Chapter 10. Going Home. Even though the war had ended and peace might return to Europe, for the surviving soldiers they all knew well that the war wasn't over. Easy Company of the 101st Airborne had to return from the front in Belgium to enter Austria, a quiet country and the birthplace of Adolf Hitler. What awaited them wasn't celebration or rest, but confusion and frustration from what was called the point system, or the unjust discharge point system. Frontline infantry soldiers who risked their lives received the same points as cooks and clerks, leading to dissatisfaction throughout the division. Soldiers like Webster were confident they had enough points to go home, but the record stated he didn't have 80 points, meaning Webster couldn't return home. This resulted in Webster expressing his and his fellow soldiers' feelings. "I hate this army so much I can never speak of it again for the rest of my life." He also wrote to his parents, "I consider 90% of my time in the army completely wasted." Webster also wrote describing his inner feelings. "The only thing I acknowledge is I learned how to get along with others." Meanwhile, Colonel Sink offered Winters a position as a career officer, and Winters took time to think about it and said he didn't want it because he couldn't accept the point system. Because many soldiers in Easy Company went through suffering and life-and-death situations, but when the war ended, they weren't allowed to go home, even though they had risked life and death together. This made frustration multiply, because they had to face a slow bureaucracy. Even medals of valor that General Maxwell Taylor awarded to console the soldiers took weeks to reach the soldiers' hands, along with 5 additional points. Points that some had to exchange with their lives. However, amid the tension, alcohol, guns, and captured vehicles became their release, leading to problems. The problem was accidents. They became the new enemy of soldiers in Austria. Within just a few weeks, statistics recorded over 70 accidents, taking over 20 soldiers' lives. One of them was a soldier named John Janovec, a paratrooper who survived the brutal battlefield of Bastogne only to die because of a broken German car door. Webster wrote that he had come so far and died while hope of going home was within reach. But then the worst incident occurred one night when a drunk American soldier lost his mind. He shot 2 Germans dead, along with a British officer who tried to stop him. Not only that, the soldier also shot Sergeant Chuck Grant, an original Toccoa paratrooper. When this news reached Ronald Spears, he decided to risk his life to take Sergeant Chuck Grant to see a German doctor, a brain specialist from Berlin. Finally, Chuck survived, but Easy Company's heart nearly broke. The perpetrator was caught later. Many soldiers in the company were angry and unforgiving. They surrounded and captured this soldier. But all the soldiers who caught this man had guns in their hands. What was memorable about this incident wasn't the anger, but the restraint, because they had killed enough already. This reflected in the eyes of every soldier in that room, even though the soldiers in the company were broken by what happened. After this, Easy Company's name would become merely a record in government documents, but the bonds between these young men would never fade. Because everyone knew well, especially Winters. Sergeant Darrell Shifty Powers wrote a letter to Winters from a hospital in Indiana on September 30th, 1945, saying, I hope we can gather together to talk because there are many things he wanted to tell Winters. The first thing I'll tell you is, you are loved and will never be forgotten by any soldier who ever served under your command. Or should I say with you? The way you led us. You are the finest soldier I ever hoped to meet. Even though Sergeant Powers wasn't a writer, he wrote from his heart and spoke for everyone who ever served in Easy Company about the bonds, trust, and respect for the man named Richard Dick Winters. Everyone who participated in the war knew well that one could gain something from war that could never be found anywhere else. Sergeant Powers also praised Dick Winters as the best friend I ever had and the bravest soldier he ever knew. This was the closing of the letter Sergeant Powers wrote to Richard Winters. Although he didn't write elegantly or poetically, it was full of sincerity from an officer who had lived and died alongside Dick Winters. Finally, Easy Company, born at Toccoa in 1942, came to an end in 1945 at Zell AMC, Austria. They saw things many people would never understand. Most importantly, they didn't fight only for their nation, but for their brothers who fought beside them. Training, fighting, hardship, and surviving life and death created bonds between Easy Company soldiers that would last forever. Every soldier agreed that the heart of Easy Company was the man named Richard Winters, the man who was the center of their spirit in Easy Company. When the guns fell silent. The real battle was just beginning, returning to the world they once knew, a world that didn't understand what they had seen. But finally they would live peacefully in the old world of a new era that they helped create. Closing. Lessons from Brotherhood. The story of Easy Company soldiers of the 101st Airborne shows that not everyone is born with courage. They were merely ordinary people, forged by extraordinary circumstances. Their story doesn't just teach us war history, but also teaches the essence of humanity, especially about friendship. Because we all know well that human bonds aren't born from words or any promises, but are forged through shared hardships. From the very beginning at Camp Toccoa, they weren't friends, just strangers wearing the same uniform with the same goal, to protect their nation. But after training that almost broke their spirits, they discovered that true strength wasn't in the muscles wrapping their bodies to look strong and impressive, but rather in the bonds connecting them together. Trust. The next lesson is the meaning of leadership. Leadership doesn't come from rank or position, but from action. Because on the day bullets were raining down, true leaders were those who ran at the front, not pushing from behind. They didn't say, "Go forward," but said, "Follow me." This is the difference that created trust among soldiers following their leader. The example was Richard Winters, whom everyone in Easy Company willingly followed because they knew this leader would never leave anyone behind. Moreover, courage doesn't mean having no fear, because everyone in Easy Company knew fear. They felt it echoing in their chests. Sometimes it made their hands shake and sweat poured down even though the air was freezing cold in the Bastogne battlefield. But finally, they chose to move forward, step by step, even though every instinct told them to run. But they never ran because they wouldn't leave anyone behind, according to Easy Company's motto, Currahee. We stand alone, but stand together. This is the true lesson of courage, standing up even when everything inside us wants to fall down. The final lesson is compassion. Even in humanity's darkest moments, humanity can still bloom, because soldiers facing brutality every day could still discover gentleness in themselves through sharing food with hungry children and treating prisoners of war with dignity. These things affirmed the humanity that remained even when it seemed something was trying to pull it away from them. Therefore, Easy Company's story teaches us that even in the deepest darkness, humans can create light through courage, sacrifice, and love for each other. This isn't merely a lesson from war, but an important lesson for life. Because the freedom we have today didn't fall from the sky, but was forged from the blood, tears, and unyielding hearts of previous generations like them, Easy Company and all brave soldiers. Finally, even though we may be in the darkest times, human values and friendship will still be the light guiding us. I believe Easy Company's story is not just a story of war, but a story of humanity, friendship, and inspiration to overcome fear. Because true courage isn't about not fearing death, but about overcoming that fear for something greater than ourselves. And this is the extraordinary story of Easy Company. As always, thank you for all your support, whether through membership, sending super thanks, and subscribing to encourage the watcher. If there are any errors, please accept our apologies. For today, goodbye.